Over the centuries, much ancient wisdom has been lost, but this is a story of rediscovery. It starts with an old legend recalled with these familiar words. The hymn Jerusalem, the famous anthem of Britain's Women's Institute. The words were written as a mystical poem by the English visionary and artist William Blake around 200 years ago, harking back to a strange story that 2,000 years ago Jesus himself had set foot in England. Could the story possibly be true? The answer to that question is full of surprises. It throws new light on the study of the ancient world and the early years of Christianity. The legend survives most strongly in Cornwall, where Jesus is said to have landed at St Just in Roseland, and in Somerset, especially the region around Glastonbury, where it became interwoven with other curious myths to do with King Arthur and the Holy Grail. Dr. Gordon Strachan is a Church of Scotland minister who teaches at Edinburgh University. Through his study of the mathematics of the ancient world, with the help of the latest archaeology, he's traced a link from the great stone circles like Stonehenge to the classical architecture of the Romans and Greeks, right up to the building of the great medieval cathedrals, and even the design of the modern-day credit card. He reads new meaning into several obscure passages from the Bible, rediscovers the secrets of sacred geometry, and shows the role Jesus himself might have played in an intriguing story.
I came late to Glastonbury. It was only in 1986. I'd heard so much about it, and I was rather suspicious of the cult. But when I got there and went up to the Tor and saw the Holy Thorn and round the Abbey, I became enchanted, and I realised why it's such an important place spiritually. And I stayed at the Chalice Well, and at Little St Michael's there they have a good library of all the books really about the background to Glastonbury and various characters who've been there and who've written about the legends. And so I spent time in retreat reading up, and the question that came to me was, why shouldn't all this be true?
So what did the legends claim? They revolved around the little-known character from the Bible, Joseph of Arimathea. He was the owner of the grave where Jesus' body was placed after the crucifixion. Some say he was Jesus' uncle, that he was a rich merchant who traded in tin, that on one of his voyages to Britain he brought his young nephew and later came to Glastonbury as the first Christian missionary to Britain. It's said that the staff he planted in the ground at Glastonbury blossomed into a thorn tree, cuttings from which survive to this day. And it's even claimed that the remains of his church lie under the ruins of the old medieval abbey. These were some of the stories Gordon was researching.
I suppose the one that stuck with me was this most outrageous reference from one of the early sources that there was this little church at Glastonbury had been the earliest Christian foundation, that it might well have been built by Joseph of Arimathea and his disciples. It might even have been built by Jesus. And one text said it was built by the hands of the Lord himself. Now, I didn't know whether I believed that. You can't prove it. But supposing it were true, then the question is, why? Why would Joseph of Arimathea have wanted to come all the way from Palestine? And why would Jesus have come?
Gordon Strachan started finding some intriguing answers to these questions when a new job took him to the Holy Land, to Galilee and Jerusalem, where he visited a garden which some say was once owned by Joseph of Arimathea, and is the site, it's claimed, of Jesus' burial and resurrection.
Well, now in Jerusalem there is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but then also there's the Garden Tomb, which is a very beautiful spot. Archaeologists say it's not the real spot. Nevertheless, first century tomb, beautiful garden. Under the shade of the trees, I thought, now, where is Arimathea? I thought, for goodness sake, 2 months ago I was in Chalice Well Garden, reputedly made originally by Joseph of Arimathea. Now I'm in Jerusalem, I'm in the garden of the Garden Tomb, and this also was supposed to belong to Joseph. Who was he? Where did he come from? So I went up to the Anglican vicar on duty and I said, do you know where Arimathea is? And he said, well, nobody really knows. It might be Ramallah or it might be Ramla. We think probably Ramla because of the church there that is dedicated to him. And I said, where's that? And he said, just about 6 miles south of Tel Aviv. I thought, that's interesting, I must try and get there. But the following week, a young archaeologist took us round the Hebrew Archaeological Museum, and we came across a set of very small standing stones, which made me think of home. And I said, is that the best Israel can do? They were very small indeed. And he rose to this and he said, no, not at all. There are very big stones in Israel at Tel Gezer. And I said, where's that? And he said, well, it's just near Ramla, just outside Tel Aviv. And this was the second time. I thought I must go there.
And so Gordon visited the church dedicated to St. Joseph of Arimathea at Ramla, before taking the path to the standing stones at Tel Gezer.
Although I was at first disappointed that they were in a straight line, they reminded me of stone rows, not stone circles, but stone rows in Britain. And I wondered whether there was some deep, forgotten connection. And we took a compass bearing on it, and these stones were north-south. We discovered that the village immediately to the north was called Ayalon. And that rang a bell with me. I thought, this is quite extraordinary. Avalon, the old name for Glastonbury. We've got Joseph of Arimathea, 6 miles up the road at Ramla. We've got standing stones in Israel, and we've got Ayalon village and Ayalon valley, Ayalon river. Was this, as it were, an ancient Hebrew Glastonbury? And was Joseph, in fact, commuting from one Glastonbury to another, both in the ancient language called Ayalon, which I think is derived possibly from Aphalach, apples, and probably from Apollo? Were we dealing with two Apollo cults, separated by 3,000 miles, but having a central headquarters in Greece?
Apollo was the Greek god of the sun, and standing stones were built, it's now believed, as solar and lunar observatories. But how did all this extraordinary speculation link into the story of Jesus coming to England? Several more pieces of the intellectual jigsaw puzzle had to be found before the picture became clear. Gordon found the next clue when exploring another archaeological site in the Holy Land, the excavations at the first century city of Sepphoris.
And Sepphoris, I discovered, had been a huge city, and this has only been excavated in the last generation. Huge Greco-Roman city with wonderful mosaics and buildings. And when we came up to the Crusader citadel, I looked across to the far horizon and I saw the line of a large town on the horizon. And I said to this Israeli beside me, I said, what's that town over there? And he said, Nazareth. I said, really, Nazareth? He said, yes, Nazareth. Why not? And I said, why not indeed? And whenever he said that, I thought, I've got it. I've got it. I know. If Jesus was a carpenter 4 miles away in a sleepy little village, he came here to work with his Father.
It's not at all impossible that Jesus went to work at Sepphoris. He would have become a man at the age of 13. That's when the obligation of education would have ceased, so then he would be free to work full-time with his Father. It depends on how quickly the work on Sepphoris went ahead. See, the average time for a Herodian city was between 10 and 12 years. Now Antipas started rebuilding Sepphoris, which had been destroyed by the Romans in reprisals for the rebellion that broke out at the death of Herod the Great, the father of Antipas, so that you calculate from, say, 3 BC, 10 years gives us 7 AD, when Jesus would have been maybe 13 years old. So there is the real possibility that he then would have begun to assist his father as an apprentice at that very young age.
But why was this significant? Well, the city was designed according to the principles of architecture made famous by Vitruvius. He showed how, by using geometry, space, and mathematics which existed in nature, a building could be constructed which was in perfect harmony with the world.
Now, Vitruvius had really just finished writing his 10 books of architecture, which are famous to this day. Also, on Vitruvian principles, a very large amphitheatre had been built, the Theatre of Marcellus, which was really the pride and joy of the new enthusiasm for Vitruvian principles and the theatre. In Sepphoris, what has been discovered is that there is a theatre built on Vitruvian lines in the 1st century, and quite possibly at the time of Antipas. Now, putting 2 and 2 together, so Jesus with his Father comes over to work in Sepphoris, and the enthusiasm for this Greco-Roman rebuilding is to bring in the principles of Vitruvius. So it's highly likely then that if Jesus is a craftsman, he is going to learn the principles of Vitruvius. I'd never brought in my own mind the Greco-Roman world so close to the Hebrew, and it seemed to me that suddenly in Sepphoris the two were coming together.
The theatre provides an extra proof that Jesus knew Sepphoris. In his preaching, Jesus used the word hypocrite to describe the Jewish priests. Now, hypocrite is a Greek word meaning stage actor, and at that time the only theatre in the area was to be found just outside Jesus' home village at Sepphoris near Nazareth.
That there was a theatre at Sepphoris is certain, even if the stone theatre that is shown today did not really exist in the 1st century, because I know that date is disputed. They would certainly have been a wooden theatre. He would certainly have seen actors, because to call someone a stage actor, that's urban language. Peasants living in the countryside who have no contact with urban life don't use that sort of language. So Jesus would certainly have seen actors, would have certainly have seen a stage, and roughly the same proportions, I'm sure, were operative on a smaller scale in a wooden theatre as in the great stone theatres that survive to this day.
The main thing about Vitruvius, I think, for succeeding generations of architects, is the theory of proportion. If you get the proportions of buildings right, the buildings themselves will be harmonious and pleasant to live in. It's still a big debate among architects today. Now, he always said that he got his theories from the ancients, and by the ancients he meant the Greeks. By the Greeks, ultimately, we mean Plato and behind him Pythagoras.
So who was Pythagoras? He was born nearly 600 years before Christ. He was a philosopher and a mathematician who stressed the importance of numbers in almost everything, in nature, music and art. He knew about the movements of the sun and moon, and his ideas were passed on by Plato and others. A cult of Pythagoras grew up after his death. So revered were his ideas that some followers thought of him as a manifestation of the god Apollo. But where did these ideas come from?
Most of his biographers say that he learnt them from his travels and that he got the ancient wisdom from all cultures.
In particular, from the north. Hyperborea, the lands beyond the north winds. And to the ancient world of the Romans and Greeks, and of the Celts in the north, mathematics was not simply an abstract science. Individual numbers had their own personalities or symbolic importance. 13, for instance, was linked to the moon, and was the number associated with darkness and misfortune. Some Jews and Greeks took the symbolism of numbers even further. Written words could be given added meaning if the letters, which spelt them out, were themselves coupled with numbers. Alpha being 1, beta being 2, and so on. The arts of numerology and gematria were widely practiced.
That intellectually curious Jews, that they should have interested themselves in Greek mathematics, both in Jerusalem and Galilee, especially in a capital city like Sepphoris, that they should have interested themselves in Greek mathematics because of the interests of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, in gematria, in the numerology of words. Then you see that is, for someone with that type of mind, that's a perfectly feasible, in fact almost probable approach.
But would Joseph, Jesus' earthly father, a carpenter by trade, have been interested in gematria, the science of linking words with numbers, and in the Pythagorean principles of Greek mathematics and architecture?
He would certainly have known the basic principles of how to build a beautiful room. You see, if it's too long and too narrow, then it simply doesn't work. You don't please your client. So there would have been every incentive for Joseph, and certainly for Jesus, then to learn the basic rules that if the width is 1, then the length should be something slightly less than 2, 1.6.
But there was something about Jesus' earthly family which suggested more. A special reason for taking an interest in mathematics, sacred geometry and Pythagorean teaching. The Essene connection. The Essenes were a Jewish cult, guardians, some say, of a tradition of secret wisdom. One group lived in the desert at Qumran, and were the original owners of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Swiss archaeologist Father Bargel Pixner was involved in excavating the Essene quarter in Jerusalem, and showed Gordon around the site.
You don't find the word Essenes in the New Testament anywhere, but you find allusions to it. They were a group of people that had their own interpretation of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, founded more or less in the 2nd century BC, and there they lived in the beginning in the desert, perhaps in the land of Damascus. Later on they came to Qumran, they lived in Qumran, but I think their main seat was right here on Mount Zion. In my opinion, the group, the family that Jesus came from were the Nazareans. The Nazareans that thought of themselves as descendants of David. They based it on the word Netzer, a shoot that came out of the root of Jesse, according to the prophecy of Isaiah. So they called themselves the offspring, the shoot off of David. And a group of them went to settle down in a village that had been abandoned for 600 years. We don't know its name, but they gave their name, the Nazareans, they gave their name to this village, and it was called Nazareth.
The Essenes lived at Qumran, but they were a tiny minority, the right wing. The rest of 4,000 Essenes, there may have been 50 at Qumran, lived in towns and villages. Nazareth could be one of them. It's just none of those are named in any way. The Essenes did have a very specific interest in Pythagorean mathematics. I mean, this is specified.
There are other pointers to Jesus' Essene connections. For instance, the reputed site of the Last Supper room is in the Essene quarter of Jerusalem. Then there's the sect's calendar. Bible scholars have long had problems understanding the chronology of the events of Holy Week, the week of Jesus' betrayal, trial and crucifixion. But using the Essene calendar, of 364 days, the timing of events can be made to make sense. And there are possible links too between the Essenes and the first Christians.
So there are many similarities in structure between Essenes and the primitive church.
Many scholars now don't doubt that Jesus and his family had some association with the Essenes. This seems to be generally accepted. Wherever I went in the Greco-Roman world, in my studies, or in the ancient Celtic world, or in the world of Palestine, it seemed as though behind it all, the numbers and the proportions, the geometry that came out was Pythagorean. And so I began to develop this idea that Jesus had been a Pythagorean Essene, and that he would have wanted to come to the source of the Pythagorean tradition, which was most probably in Britain, in the far north.
And to meet the Druids, who are the custodians of the ancient wisdom. For the Essenes and Druids had much in common.
They studied the same sort of things, like astrology, cosmology, herbalism, doctors, predicting the future. Lots of what would be thought of as fairly occult things, which get into Judaism via the Essenes and which were preserved by the Druids and later were marginalized by the Christians. But there does seem to be an international movement or tradition of wisdom, which is partly Druid and is partly Essene. And these groups of people, the Therapeutai in Egypt, the Brahmins, various other groups, which are linked somehow or other to the original Pythagorean community. And that I found was the common factor. If Jesus had come to Britain, then his motive might well have been to meet with the Druids, because they were the ancient wise men of Britain.
But is it practical to suggest Jesus would have travelled thousands of miles in his esoteric quest?
Oh, there was trade between the coast and the north. I mean, the Phoenicians, long before the time of Christ, went to Cornwall. I mean, they were trading tin. I've been told by an Irish archaeologist that the Bronze Age jewellery in Ireland is very similar to jewellery of that period in this part of the world. You have dolmens here, you have dolmens in the Celtic areas in the north. You have standing stones in the north, you have standing stones down here at Gazer, you see. So how you explain all those links, you see, it's difficult to say, but remember, they're not huge distances.
And certainly in Julius Caesar's writings, he confirms that ancient Britain was a place visited